Firstly, thanks to the organisers for inviting me here to talk to you all about gut health, which I hope over the next half an hour you'll appreciate is not just another food trend, but really is a landmark scientific discovery that's essentially redefining how foods can impact our health and overall happiness. Now, before we dive into gut health, I think it's really important that we're all on the same page of what actually is gut health. Because yes, half of the media is talking about it every second day, but what it is exactly is actually rarely communicated. So I'll get you involved for this one, a good old-fashioned raise of hands. Who thinks gut health is related to A, digestion? No one's game? If you don't put your hand up at one point, I'm going to dob you in. So, okay, 15% of people is going to say A, it's about digestion. Who's going to say B, it's about the bacteria? 30% of people? Who's going to say C, it's about A, B, C, and more? Yeah, okay, a good 60%. And who's going to be really honest and say, actually, they're not quite sure what gut health is? Yeah, good, honest people, about 10% of people. So, gut health relates to the functioning of our entire digestive tract, which is this 9-meter long tube that essentially delivers food from entry all the way to exit. And if I had to summarize why gut health really is so important, there are 3 key things. The first one is around the old saying, we are what we eat. Now, if we actually look at the science, it's probably not actually accurate. It's more we are what we digest. Because even if we do put the healthiest foods into our body, if we don't have a strong digestive tract, that 9 meters, then essentially we're not going to extract that nutrition out of the food, and therefore it's just going to go straight through us. So if we really want to get the most out of our food, essentially, we have to have good gut health. The second element relates to the fact that 70% of our immune system actually lays along that 9 meters. So if we want things like less sick days, lower risk of allergies and autoimmune conditions, essentially we have to have good gut health. And the third element, which is really what's brought the fame to this concept of gut health, is the fact that we all contain trillions of microbes. So along that digestive tract lives trillions of microbes. And it's these microbes which we're starting to appreciate, do so much for us. And it's essentially redefining what it means to be human. So over the next half an hour, we only have half an hour, and I could obviously speak about gut health for, several hours, if not days. I'm going to briefly go through, just quickly touching on what actually happens along that 9-meter digestive tract, looking at what these microbes actually do for us on a day-to-day basis, and therefore why should we be nurturing them. We'll also look, most importantly for you guys, nutrition for the gut. So what sorts of things should we be feeding our body? I'll very quickly touch on common gut complaints because I think that is a real opportunity in food industry. We'll skip a couple of chapters from the book because, again, we don't have time, but all the rest is in Eat Yourself Healthy. And then I'll conclude by touching on, what does all the science mean in terms of what people should be putting on their plate and what foods you guys all should be making in terms of feeding the nation's guts. So, understanding the gut. This is something which is, quite bizarre in that we're starting, as a society, more and more people are focusing what we're putting into our body, but as soon as we swallow it, people actually have no idea of what happens. And I think it is really important people start to understand that because it not only helps them fight against the myths, which no doubt are coming and arising as gut health becomes, a trend and very topical, but also if people are getting gut symptoms, which is, about 40% of people at some stage, it can actually provide them with a little bit of comfort and understanding that if they hear their belly grumbling, they'll understand, oh, actually, that's just my migrating motor complex, cleaning my gut, it's fine, I don't need to worry about it. Or I'm a little bit bloated, but hey, that's fine, my microbes are just eating the right food, so that's fine, I shouldn't worry about that. So, digestion begins in the mouth. Now, I think we certainly forget about that, on the wide we think, oh, it all happens in our stomach. But actually, we not only start to physically break down the food with our teeth, but we contain enzymes in our saliva, which start to chemically break down the food. In fact, a really nice study has compared people who chew their food 10 times versus those who chew their food 40 times. And you can see the pink bar is the one where they only chewed their food 10 times, and they measured the amount of energy in people's stool. So essentially, it's showing that those who only chewed their food 10 times is malabsorbing a lot of that nutrition. So digestion begins in the mouth. And I think that's a really important fact we should help the public understand. Once we've chewed it, we swallow it, goes down our food pipe or our esophagus and into our stomach. Now, our stomach is very much like a washing machine because it not only physically chucks around the food, but it releases a range of digestive enzymes and acids which kind of clean the food. Once it's reached like a puree consistency after a couple of hours, depending on the size of the meal, it makes its way into this next part called the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is a crazy name because this is 6 meters long. Not small at all. Now, it's here where actually most of our food gets from our gut into our blood and then goes and feeds the rest of our body. So you can see that filtration happening there. Now, everything that doesn't get digested in the small intestine, although most things do, makes their way into the final part where those microbes live. So certain types of nutrients like dietary fiber, humans don't have the enzymes to break that up. And therefore, it gets malabsorbed in that small intestine and makes its way into the large intestine where the bacteria are. Other things, like if we have really large amounts of protein, that can overwhelm our body's ability to absorb that in the small intestine, and it gets into the large intestine where the bacteria can also feast on it. So that's what's happening along that 9-meter digestive tract. Now let's actually look at what these microbes are doing for us on a day-to-day basis. So, the microbes, people have probably heard the word the bacteria, and yes, lower in our intestine, most of the microbes are actually bacteria. But I think it's important we start to realize actually it's not just bacteria, it's things like parasites and viruses and fungi such as yeast, which actually synergistically work within our gut to look after us. So gone are the days where we should be fearing those names, and we should start to celebrate that actually they're doing a lot for the human body. And we start to see actually in some of the clinical trials that people who lack some of these things like the parasites and viruses within their gut actually at higher risk of getting things like gut infections. So they really are looking after us. A fun fact, which I think anyone who's following the gut health trend will certainly be aware of, in that if we counted all the cells in the human body, we actually contain more bacterial cells than we do human cells. So essentially, we're kind of like aliens in disguise. They outnumber us. And what's even more, I think, powerful is the fact that in terms of their genes, the number of skills they have, the number of things they can actually do, far exceeds that of what humans could do on their own. So, a stat that's quite humbling for the human ego is that these microbes can survive without us, but humans could not live without these microbes. And another interesting thing is the fact that each of us have our own community and unique community of these trillions of microbes. So even identical twins, they've got the same genetics, but their microbes are actually very different. And that's because we actually acquire it as we develop. So it's really a reflection of our diet and our lifestyle throughout our lifespan. Now, when I'm talking about microbes, people kind of go, revert back to being selfish and go, okay, yeah, we get it, they're living in us, and like we're giving them a home, but what are they actually doing for us? Why should I care about these things? So I put together a little CV for these microbes. And the first thing is that these microbes actually have exceptional communication skills. So there's 3 main ways in which we think these microbes can communicate with the rest of our body. This first one is via our immune system, which kind of makes sense, given, remember, 70% lays along there. And it's like an alarm system. So if our microbes sense something's going on inside us, it triggers the immune system, produce inflammatory markers, which can talk to things like our brain and other parts of our body. We also have this other type of communication, which is kind of like a mobile phone. So its electric signal goes up. The microbes can send these messages up via this nerve called the vagus nerve up to our brain and other parts of our body. And the third one is what I like to think of as snail mail, and that these microbes actually produce chemicals from a lot of the food that we eat. They break them down, produce chemicals which get into our blood and then communicate and enter things like our brain and our liver, etc. So it's those 3 pathways. Now, our microbes are also very experienced bodyguards. This here looks a little bit sciencey, but it's what we call a systematic review. And I think everyone in food industry should start to be aware of a little bit more of the science around how things are graded. And a systematic review is essentially where they pull together all individual clinical trials. So this systematic review included 13 individual clinical trials. So it looks at the whole body of evidence. And what they did is they pulled together those 13 trials that all looked at a probiotic versus placebo, which is like a fake intervention, and looked at whether the probiotic actually had any benefit on reducing people's risk of getting the common cold. And what they found is, yeah, compared to having a fake intervention, the probiotic actually did overall decrease people's risk of getting a common cold. And if they did happen to get a common cold, it reduced the duration of that cold by 2 days if they were having that probiotic versus having the fake intervention. And remember, all these people were blinded to it, so they didn't know which one they were getting, which is really important to eliminate some of that bias. So in that example, remember, probiotics is the good bacteria. It's a good example of how these microbes actually really can look after us. Another facet to their CV is that these microbes are pharmacists in disguise, essentially, and that they can produce a range of different vitamins and hormones that our body needs. And also we know that they can interact with different drugs. And one example of the way that they can interact with it is with different types of drugs we give to people who've got inflammatory bowel disease. So you may have heard of it before. IBD affects about 1 in every 200 people. And what we do actually is give people inactive drugs. They swallow it down, the microbes ferment it lower down and activate it. So it's got more of that targeted approach. Another thing the microbes can do is actually deactivate some drugs, and that's why we think some people require higher doses of different drugs to have a benefit, because their microbes, unique to them, can actually metabolize it and break down and result in having a lower effect. Also, some microbes can ferment different drugs and turn them into toxic waste products, which is why some people can react to things like anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, and they can get stomach ulcers because the microbes actually ferment it and produce some toxins. Now, this sort of research is really starting to blow our minds in terms of what we can do in predicting who and who will not respond to different therapies. And there's been quite a lot in the media lately around using our microbes, so literally just getting a stool sample and using that to have a look at which microbes are in people, and that helps determine whether people will respond to different therapies. And a lot of it, like I said, has been done in cancer therapy, but my research group also just published a paper last year highlighting that we could predict the response using fecal samples of people with irritable bowel syndrome, something that affects about 1 in 10 people in the UK, whether they would respond to different dietary interventions, including probiotics and this other clinical diet that we use. So I think this personalization based on the different metabolic potential of our microbes is really where I think the future will end up being. Another thing that microbes are is quite the influencer, and that they've been shown to be linked to the health of pretty much every other organ in the human body. In fact, this great review paper, again, they pulled together all different studies, showed that a dysbiotic microbiota, which essentially means the microbes are unbalanced, was linked with over 70 different chronic diseases. Now, this is where, again, we need to put our critical hats on and have a little bit more in-depth understanding of what does linked mean and what does association mean, 2 words that the media always use. And by this, we need to understand the different hierarchy of evidence. So you can see at the very low level, we have anecdotal evidence, and that's when someone on social media posts about having a probiotic, so the live bacteria, and say, oh my God, it's really changed my mood, I'm so much happier. Now, if you're sitting at home, you're probably thinking, oh, gee, I should probably get one of them. I could do with a bit of a mood booster. But little do you know, behind closed doors, that person has just got a work promotion, they've just got a puppy, and they're in a new relationship. So those sorts of factors are probably more likely to impact their mood rather than that probiotic. Now, the next level up is what we call observational studies, and this is where a lot of the research in the area of gut health has really come from, and it's worthwhile, it's important, but it's probably not as strong as others out there. So observational is where we take a group of people who have depression and those people without depression, and we look at what types of bugs they've got in them, what types of microbes. And we've clearly seen that those who have depression have slightly different microbes than those who don't have depression. But observational studies don't tell you anything about causal relationship. It's a bit of a case of the chicken and the egg. Is it that these people who have depression are typically less likely to go to the farmers markets, get fresh fruit and veggies, and that's why their microbes are different? Or could it actually be certain types of microbes are actually sending negative communication molecules up to the brain and triggering people who are susceptible to depression? Now, we go up a little bit higher to intervention studies, and I'll show you one of these. This is essentially where you take a group of people who are depressed and you put them on one intervention or another intervention, and that there helps you identify whether there really is that causal link. And then the higher one up is that systematic review, which I showed you around that flu study. That was pooling together all of that evidence. Now that's enough of the science. Let's move on to the area which I'm sure most of you actually want to hear about. Nonetheless, I think it is important that you'll have a little bit of insight into the science of where this area is at, in that a lot of the studies are coming from observational data, and that it means that it's really interesting and there's a lot of potential, but we haven't quite gotten all over to that intervention area. We're moving there as we speak. Now, if we think about our approach to nutrition, forever we've known that food has an impact on our health. We've known that for so many years, but how we've appreciated it or how we've understood it is through the lens of human metabolism. We've been very focused that foods do this, they'll increase your cholesterol because of how the cells metabolize things. But now, over the past decade, since we've started to appreciate these trillions of microbes living within us, we've actually started to recognize, actually, there is a new pathway to which food impacts our health, and that is via this microbial metabolism. And we also see that between the microbes and humans, we also have this interplay of metabolism. Now, I think it's this awareness of these microbes has started us to kind of rethink of some of the ingredients we're putting into foods. For example, a lot of the food additives out there, of course, they've all been approved and have got the GRAS approval of, generally regarded as safe. However, all the studies have been based on human metabolism. So yes, they don't seem to interact with the human cells. However, we're starting to appreciate that, we've forgotten the fact that, or we didn't realize the fact that these could be impacting our microbes. And there's been a number of studies coming out now in animal models suggesting that there are a number of key additives which actually could be having a negative impact on our health. In fact, my research group at King's have just started a clinical trial looking at specific types of additives and whether that increases people's risk of things like inflammatory bowel disease. And the animal models suggested also obesity. There is that link there. So in the area of food additives, I think it is very much kind of watch this space of which ones may be coming off market because actually they are influencing the microbial metabolism. Our microbes' favorite nutrients. What do we think? Who's going to go A, it's protein? 5% of people. Who's going to say B, it's the carbs, all carbs? 10% of people. Who's going to say C, it's fiber? Yeah, 70% of people. And who's going to say D, that it's fat? Yep, no one's game. Okay, so yes, C, it's dietary fiber. And I kind of gave it away a little bit before, and that human cells can't actually digest fiber. Fiber, which comes from all our plant-based foods, its sole purpose actually is to feed those bacteria. And again, we didn't understand why fiber was beneficial. We did know it was beneficial. We saw all those observational studies, and people that had heaps of fiber had a lower risk of all these different diseases. And we thought, it does something with our poo, but we didn't really understand what, and now we do. It feeds the microbes, keeps them happy, and that's why there is all these links. Not to get too sciencey, but I think you guys are up for it. So what happens when our microbes eat fiber? Remember, that's in the large intestine, lower down. They produce these chemicals called short-chain fatty acids, and it's those chemicals which go and talk to the other organs. Remember, I mentioned one of the mechanisms was via that postal system. So they get into the blood, and they can trigger different pathways throughout the rest of the body. Things like reducing the glucose production in our body. Some of them can also pass that blood-brain barrier, which not many things can, and I think that's a really important fact. So the power of fiber, the media have started to jump on this nutrient, which I think is, for the better. But here's a really great study. It's one of those systematic reviews. Remember I spoke about that, where they pulled together all these studies. In fact, it included millions of people, but it was the observational one. So it wasn't that high level, but still, I think with numbers like this, it is a really important one. And you can see that percentage there. So for every 8 grams of fiber per day, as a nation, if we could have this, we would reduce our risk of heart disease by 19%, type 2 diabetes by 15%, and colon cancer by 8%, just from adding in an extra 8 grams of fiber. Now, anyone in the room who's not a nutritionist or a dietitian is probably thinking, okay, well, what the hell is 8 grams of fiber? So here's some of the translations. So it's a large potato with the skin on, it's a cup of beans, or it's 1 serve of my new granola from Bio and Me. So 8 grams seems to be this number. It is a bit arbitrary. It's just from this systematic review, which showed it has this kind of protective effect to those degrees there. A really interesting point, an important point, is that not all fiber is the same. So I think we've kind of jumped into this understanding of, oh, you know, it's like a protein or fat. They're kind of just the same thing. There is close to 100 different types of dietary fibers, and each type we see essentially can do different things. So from each of these different food groups, I think it's important we are getting different types of fiber in. In fact, this study really does highlight, I guess, the potential of different fibers for different health benefits. Included, again, close to 2 million people, so very large, although it was that observational type of evidence. And what they looked at was all fiber on reduction of cancer, and they found that yes, for every 10 grams increase in dietary fiber, you'd reduce your bowel cancer risk by 10%, which is very similar to the other stat I showed you. They then went a step further, and they looked at the fiber just from whole grains, and found again, for every 10 grams increase in that type of fiber, you'd reduce your risk of bowel cancer by 10%. But they then looked at the fiber from fruit and veg, and did not see that a protective association. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the fiber from whole grains is any more beneficial for overall health than that from veggies and fruits, but it does highlight that actually the different fibers can do different things in our body. So, you know, this trend to go completely grain-free, I think there is some consequences that we're starting to see, and we know that can negatively impact some of our microbes. And similarly, there was another study in breast cancer which showed a similar association. So as a nation, how is the UK doing? And in fact, most of the Western world, I know this is an international conference, most of the Western world is very similar, and that we certainly aren't getting enough dietary fiber. So just around under 40% of below requirements. And also the diversity is really quite poor. In fact, if we look at the latest National Diet and Nutrition Survey that came out in the UK, it gives us a better idea of where people are getting their fiber from, which probably from a quick glimpse you think, oh, that makes sense, you know, veg and potato, cereals, all high fiber foods. But if you delve into that a little bit further, you see that actually majority of the fiber from the veg and potato group comes from things like fried chips, which are not the greatest sources. Similarly, in the cereals, majority actually comes from refined grains, so white pasta and bread. Now, just to remind you all of the differences between the whole grain versus the refined grain. Refined grains, they've got that big bran layer stripped from them, and it's the bran layer which has majority of that fiber. So if you think about that, it's the refined grain that's contributing to the fiber intake, despite it being very low in fiber, really highlighting that just because we're eating so much of this refined grain, that's why it's contributing. So an easy switch in, if we just added in or got people to have that bran, then actually we could make a big impact on how much fiber people are getting. Diversity, plant-based diversity is another one that's starting to really pique interest based on some of the research out there. And I think it's come from the fact that we focused on fiber, which is great, but also plants contain many other chemicals which we are starting to see are really beneficial and can, you know, get metabolized by our bacteria. So these things called the prebiotics, which is essentially food for the good bacteria, and polyphenols, which are the things in red wine and dark chocolate and why we've associated them with benefit. In fact, 90% of polyphenols can't be digested by human cells. Again, they get to the lower part and the bacteria then ferment them. So we're starting to appreciate that actually so much we've known about food is we've started to, the metabolism of it is a little bit more differently. The mechanism of how it's having a benefit has kind of changed in our understanding as we've appreciated these microbes. So a paper here showed that those people who had 30 different types of plant-based foods a day actually had a greater diversity range of microbes in their gut, which is what we see essentially as kind of the ideal. We want a wide range of bacteria, because essentially that means we're going to have more skills within us, because each different bacteria does different things. So here it showed that the more diversity of plant-based ingredients people were having, the more diverse ranges of bacteria, and which lowers their risk of many different chronic diseases. And that's actually one of the principles within my BioMe granola. In fact, we have 15 different plant-based ingredients per serve. So I want you all to have a quick think about, in fact, we're not going to have time, but this is some homework for you, to have a think about how many plant-based species you have in your diet per week. My target for you is to try to get 30. Now, it sounds like a lot from the outset, but so many simple things you can do, even if it's just a teaspoon of mixed seeds on your breakfast, whatever you're having, that's 4 points extra that you're getting. Instead of always getting the steamed broccoli, get the steamed multi-pack. So again, those sorts of messages I think we can really do a lot with in terms of food industry. A trial that I really wanted to show you because it, I think, is such a strong, powerful study highlighting the link between our microbes and our mental health. So this one here was one of those intervention studies, so one of those good quality studies where it took people who had moderate to severe depression, and it randomized them to either getting this gut-boosting diet, which was super, super high in fiber, or getting this placebo-befriending type of counseling. Now, it was really important they had that placebo just to make sure any benefit of the diet wasn't because they were actually seeing that dietitian in the food group, but solely because of the food. They got them to come back after 12 weeks and reassess their mental health. And what they found in the diet group, 32% of them had a significant improvement in their depression scores, which would have classified them as no longer clinically depressed. In the placebo group, that was only 8%. I think that's just so powerful given the only thing they changed was their diet. Now, for anyone in the room, if you are on medications for depression, certainly this study, all the patients stayed on their medications, so the message is not to stop medications and just go diet. Here it shows that as an adjunct therapy, diet can be hugely powerful, and in my clinical practice, and I've got some of the stories in the book, with people's GP, I've been able to help them lower their dose of antidepressants by boosting up their diet. So what does this diet actually look like that they gave the participants? Well, it contained 50 grams of fiber a day. In the UK, remember, we're having about 19 grams. Government says 30 grams. This study gave 50 grams. Now, I'd be biased if I said it was all down to the fiber. There's many other key nutrients which we know is linked with better mental health. So it's probably more of that holistic approach of whole foods. Fermented foods, that's another really hot topic. Now I'm just going to breeze through that by giving you a reference to a paper our group recently looked at, where we look at the different mechanisms of action of how fermented foods may actually impact our health. And there are so many different ways it can do that. However, when we think about those clinical trials, which is kind of the important type of evidence, they really are lacking. In fact, the one with the most evidence for it only had 2 clinical trials, but actually was kefir. Does anyone ever make kefir? Yeah, okay, good. There's a few other fermenters. It literally is the easiest thing people can make, and there's 2 main types of kefir. There is water kefir, you can see the translucent grains, or the dairy kefir. Now, the evidence is all for the dairy kefir, and it suggests it can, improve your risk of getting gut infections and also digestion. But the thing with fermented foods, why I'm so pro it, even though the clinical evidence isn't overly robust, is the fact that our ancestors have been having these for thousands of years and associating them with benefit. Plus, they taste great. And I think at the end of the day, we need to remember food is about pleasure. It should be tasty. If we can add on a health benefit on top of that, then we're going to be having a winner. Probiotics, the public have become very skeptical of this word because the media have started to push back and say, look, probiotics are useless. So when I'm seeing people in clinic, they're like, oh, I'm not going to take a probiotic because it's useless. Now, for many conditions, I think there is no need to take a probiotic. In fact, a lot of the cereal products out there at the moment, they're just chucking in a bacteria and claiming there's a benefit there. But what we see is that they're not going to have benefit for human health if they just pick any random one. There is a select kind of group of different microbes which we see can have a real benefit for people, like those with the flu. However, the food industry at the moment, I think, is not quite getting this concept of microbes. In fact, there is thousands of different types of strains, types of microbes out there, and each one does different things. It's kind of like, if you've got iron deficiency, you're not going to go and take a vitamin D supplement and expect your iron deficiency to get better, right? because each different strain actually has different functions and does different things. So we need to start looking and asking ourselves more of, which type should I be taking, what dose I should be taking, and things like that. So I think we need to be very careful of just going, oh, look, I'm going to chuck in some live bacteria into these chips or into some granola just so I can say it's live, because the public are becoming more skeptical because there is zero evidence for them. Common gut complaints, this is just to highlight that, this is quickly a disclosure, if anyone has any common gut complaints, if you've got these, then definitely go to your doctor, your GP first, because it can be masking something else. But I think there is a huge market for helping people with gut complaints. Like I said before, some surveys suggest that as many as 40% of people will experience some sort of digestive discomfort. And you can see here how much the government is actually spending per year just on constipation alone. Now, a lot of gut discomfort can be resolved through diet and lifestyle. So again, a big market there. Now, on this, I wanted to make it a little bit personal because a lot of people ask me, how do you know if my gut is healthy? Now, sadly, there is no single assessment to assess that, but I have put together 10 different questions, which is based on, I guess, where the science is at. So if you go to theguthealthdoctor.com, you can check in and see where you fit in terms of the spread of, healthiest of guts. Now, on to the last section, just in the kitchen. And this is something that I've, again, put together because people are asking, well, what does all that mean? What should I be eating? And the thing is, there is no one gut-boosting diet out there. It's different for different people. But if I had to have a go at kind of reformulating the Eat Well plate, the government's Eat Well plate, this is what I would put it as for good gut health. Alongside these key principles there, so mostly plants, dabbling in fermented foods, diversity all the way, whole and natural versus refined and perfect, getting amongst those legumes, dabbling in fermented food, as I just repeated myself, and also the last one around taste, pause, explore, and enjoy. Again, remembering food has to taste good for people to want to buy it, and this brings me to my Prebiotic chocolate bark. Just to end on a little story here, which is kind of my principle and my philosophy around looking after our gut. And I came up with this recipe for the book just a couple of years ago, and it was just after I'd finished my PhD at Easter time, and white chocolate is my favorite food. And I thought to myself at Easter, as I was about to plow my face into like a bucket load of it, God, I'm being a bit selfish, aren't I? Like, here I am learning about all the amazing things these microbes are doing for me on a daily basis. And I'm about to just celebrate with my taste buds and completely neglect them. So what I did is like, well, why don't I merge the worlds together? Why don't I add in some polyphenols from extra virgin olive oil to feed those microbes, and also some prebiotic foods like dried mango and pistachios, which again feed those microbes. Add some drizzle of dark chocolate, again contains more of those phytochemicals, and there I've turned in a food that was very selfish and very much about my taste buds into a food that not only I still really enjoy, in fact, I probably prefer this over the plain white chocolate, into a food that both I and my microbes can enjoy. So thinking about that every meal, not just feeding your human cells, but thinking about these guys looking after you, what can you add to your meal that will also feed them? And with that, I will finish up. And I don't think we've got time for questions, but I will be around later, so you can certainly ask away. Thank you.